So I'd like to tell you a story of a little girl that was so lonely that she held her own hand, for the fear that if she were to go and disturb other people with her emotions, that they would leave her, that they would be so overwhelmed by her emotions and theirs because they just seemed so chaotic and messy, unable to deal with their own emotions. And because they were so chaotic and messy, she decided she would be the strong one. And so she was. And she bottled her feelings up, and she never said anything, in spite of constant worry, in spite of anxiety that kept her up late at night, fearful that her mother would die, in spite of the fact that she was bullied at school and she felt different to everyone else. In spite of all these things, she continued to bottle all of her emotions up, until one day she couldn't keep them bottled up anymore. In fact, what she'd begun to do was to cut herself with razor blades, because what she realized was when she was in physical pain, it was a delightful distraction from the mental and emotional pain that she was in. And one day, she realized that this might be a problem, that these weren't coping mechanisms that could continue. And once the floodgates opened, she couldn't stop. She cried, she screamed, she had panic attacks for hours, every single night, for weeks and weeks on end. She just cracked. And at the age of 15, it was described that she'd had a nervous breakdown. In fact, she went into psychosis and was seeing hands and spiders and things coming out of the walls, probably from the lack of sleep, because the insomnia had lasted for months at this point. So much so that the doctor recommended that she was sectioned. But her mother said no. And so she returned back home, and she continued to struggle alone, with no one around her that knew what to do. Just other people who were struggling with their emotions also did not know how to help themselves, trying to help her with a lack of knowledge. We're all victims of victims. And at 16, she discovered drugs. And she felt finally that there was some opportunity to have happiness. At 17, she discovered more drugs. At 18, she discovered more drugs. At 19, she discovered boys, bad boys. And she was thrown out of her home after a massive argument with her father that left him in the cells, and her terrified that when he came home, she didn't know what would happen. And so within weeks, she left the home that she spent her whole life in, 19 years from the day she was born. She left that home and moved into a tiny little room in a home that was owned by a man that oddly reminded her of her father and displayed some of the behaviours, but was pretending to be much kinder than he actually was, because he wanted to sleep with her, which is something that she hadn't encountered up until now. Then the eating disorders began, and the cocaine use, the bulimia, the starving oneself, the self-harming was still happening. For the rest of the time between 19 and 26, things went like a blur, because there was so much drug use and trauma and pain and suffering that she just kept going round and round the circles of inadequacy and hating oneself and feeling like she needed to be more than what she was and more than what she could be, and that she was far too full of trouble and trauma that nobody would love her anyway. And every time this thought pattern continued, she fell into suicidal ideation, that it was the only way out and that death would be her only friend. Then at some point she decided to change. She wanted more for her life. And she did. She found more for her life. She created more for her life. In fact, she did a significant amount. She went to university, she went to college, she changed everything in her world. She healed her trauma, she healed all of the things that were difficult in her life, and she found ways to get over drug addiction, eating disorders, bulimia, binge eating. She found ways to love herself. And before she knew it, everything completely changed in her life. There was pain still, but there was not suffering. There was peace and there was contentment, and most importantly, there was self-love, and there was boundaries, and there was hope. And that's me. And why I do what I do? Because I want other people to feel what I feel. I want other people to no longer suffer in the way that I did, alone, holding my hand because there's no one else there. I want to be the hand that you hold, so you're not so lonely through the darkness, and so that the pain isn't suffering.